Okay, so let's talk about the Great Barrier Reef. I mean, it's this massive, iconic wonder, right? And we all kind of feel like we know the story. But what if the story we're constantly hearing in the headlines isn't quite the whole story? In this explainer, we're going to dig into a really different perspective, one that looks at decades of official data to ask a pretty bold question about what's really going on with the reef. And it all kicks off with this statement. A pretty shocking claim, wouldn't you say? It just seems to fly in the face of, well, everything we hear about coral bleaching. But here's the kicker. According to the analysis we're diving into, this isn't just some random opinion. Nope. It's a conclusion pulled directly from decades of official scientific monitoring. And really, that's the big question, isn't it? Is the reef thriving? Is it on its last legs? Or is the reality, a whole lot more complicated? To figure that out, we've got to follow the data. So, first things first. Let's talk about the story that most of us are familiar with. The dominant narrative, the one about a fragile ecosystem that's right on the brink, a planetary treasure in some serious trouble. Yeah, this narrative is incredibly powerful. It's built on these heartbreaking images of bleached coral and stark warnings that were past the point of no return. And all of that, of course, fuels these urgent calls for action, which often lead to proposals for pretty major economic and industrial restrictions, all in the name of saving the reef. But what happens when we take a step back from the day-to-day headlines and just look at the long-term data? Well, according to the analysis we're unpacking here, a very different story, a kind of counter-narrative starts to pop right out of the numbers. And we're not talking about a small snapshot in time. The data we're looking at comes from 38 years, almost 4 decades, of continuous monitoring by the Australian Institute of Marine Science, or AIMS. This is a massive, official data set giving us a really long-term view of the reef's health. This brings us to the real heart of the argument, a 2025 paper by a researcher named Alberto Boretti. What his study does is take that entire 38-year AIMS data set, analyze it, and come to some conclusions that flat-out challenge that doomed reef story we hear so much about. So, what did the study actually find? Well, let's break it down. First, it argues that coral cover just recently hit its highest point since they even started keeping track back in 1985. Wild, right? Then it says there's no clear, consistent link between rising temps and long-term coral decline. And maybe, most importantly, it highlights that the reef is incredibly good at bouncing back after things like bleaching events, framing them not as a death sentence, but as part of a natural, recoverable cycle. And this chart really drives that point home. Just look at the AIMS data for 2023-24. It shows coral cover in the northern and central sections hitting record highs, the best they've been in decades. This is the kind of data that directly fuels the study's claim that we're looking at a resilient system. So, if the reef isn't just in a simple, straight line of decline, what's actually happening? The source material here argues that the key is to stop thinking of the reef as this fragile, static thing. Instead, we should see it as a dynamic system that's defined by these natural cycles of resilience. And here's basically how that cycle works, according to this analysis. First, a disturbance hits. Could be a storm, a bleaching event, or even an outbreak of starfish. Naturally, coral cover drops. But then, these fast-growing corals, like the Acropora species, the branching ones, they act like first responders. They drive the super rapid rebound, showing just how much capacity the system has to recover. Okay, but the story isn't just a simple case of everything's fine, nothing to see here. The very latest data from 2024-25 throws a major wrench into the simple narrative of resilience. Right after hitting those record highs we just saw, the AIMS data shows a sharp, sudden downturn. And this big drop was directly linked to a major mass bleaching event in 2024, which in turn was tied to some record-breaking marine heat waves. And wow. The numbers on this table are pretty stark. Just look at that change column. The northern region, down almost 10 percentage points, and the southern region, a massive 12-point drop. I mean, for both of those areas, that's a record drop for a single year. It basically wiped out all those recent gains in one fell swoop. So the key takeaway here, according to the source, isn't a simple story of steady, irreversible decline. It's a story of volatility. The data shows the reef experiencing these dramatic swings, from record highs to sudden steep drops. It paints a picture of a system that's definitely under pressure, but one that's dynamic and fluctuating, not just spiraling down in a straight line. So why does all this matter so much? Why get into the weeds of reef data? Well, because this isn't just some academic debate, it's actually at the very center of a huge, high stakes argument about Australia's entire economic future and its national energy policy. You see, the source material we're looking at argues that how you interpret this reef data leads to two completely different paths forward. On one hand, you've got what the source calls the alarmist view. The reef is doomed, so we need to hit the brakes, restrict everything, and go all in on net zero policies. But on the other hand, you have what it calls the realist view. That one says, hey, the reef is resilient. And if that's true, it argues, then maybe Australia should be focusing on using its resources and becoming an energy powerhouse. The core of this energy realism argument, as laid out in the source, is pretty straightforward. Australia is sitting on massive resources: coal, gas, uranium, you name it. The argument goes that if the reef is actually resilient, then the environmental case for not using these resources gets a lot weaker. Therefore, the nation's focus should be on affordable energy and building prosperity, guided by this interpretation of the facts, not by fear. So at the end of the day, here's the core thesis we've unpacked. It's an argument that takes the scientific claim of the Great Barrier Reef's resilience and uses it as a foundation for a very specific policy path, one that pushes back against de-industrialization and makes the case for the pragmatic use of Australia's abundant energy resources. And all of this leaves us with one final and really critical question. The story of the Great Barrier Reef becomes this fascinating case study for a much bigger challenge we all face. When a really powerful emotional public narrative collides with a complex and, in this case, pretty controversial set of data, which one should be guiding our most important policy decisions?